This is a Global News special presentation.
Good morning on this Wednesday, November 11th, as Canada remembers at cenotaphs and memorials in cities and towns across this country. This is the scene in Ottawa, where the National Ceremony of Remembrance takes place every year at the National War Memorial. The ceremonies will look a little different this year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Hello, I'm Robin Gill. Thank you for taking time out of your day to pause and reflect. The National Ceremony of Remembrance will begin in just under half an hour from now, and we will pause at the top of the hour for the moment of silence in honor of the hour when the guns fell silent. As we mentioned, this year's ceremony will be slightly different. Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stevenson is near the National War Memorial, where it's understandably a smaller crowd because of the need to protect Canadians from the pandemic. Mercedes, what strikes you this morning?
Robin, I've never seen this. I've been covering Remembrance Day for 10 years, and there are always crowds as deep as the eye can see. Thousands of people who come not only from around Ottawa, but from around the country to observe Remembrance Day and to remember the fallen right here in Ottawa. And as I look around me here today, there is just a sprinkling of people, a few veterans with their medals on who are standing socially distant. The Legion has been asking people not to come out, instead to watch the broadcast like this one on television. But this is a really difficult day for veterans for that reason. I've been speaking to a lot of vets, and I think it's important for us to pause and remember that as well, that normally there is a camaraderie. Brothers and sisters in arms are able to get together, they comfort one another, they remember the fallen, they work through their experiences. You don't have that this Remembrance Day. You don't have that ability to feel the emotion together that can be so cathartic and important for veterans. So I think that this is a particularly challenging Remembrance Day. First of all, the pandemic putting stress on so many people, especially veterans who may be isolated already or at risk of homelessness. Now on top of that, they're not able to gather for public health reasons to keep people safe. And of course, Robin, also we have had a very large number of deaths in the Canadian Armed Forces this year, a number of training deaths. You remember that Captain Jennifer Casey died. She was one of the snowbirds. She was the public affairs officer on the team. Then we lost another 6 Canadians in the crash of the Stalker helicopter off a Canadian Navy ship. And then Corporal Choi, who was shot and killed by accident on a training exercise just a few days ago. So this is a very, very difficult year for the armed forces as they reflect. And of course, we remember those who brought the war home with them and lost the battle to it at home, because talking about the mental health effects of war and what it has done in terms of suicides to former members of the armed forces is something else that weighs heavily on the minds of many today.
Thank you for that, Mercedes. Our David Aiken has also been covering Remembrance Day ceremonies for many years. What strikes you immediately about this year, David?
Well, good morning, Robin. You know, this must be my 15th year or so of covering this particular event. I'm just in front of the National War Memorial on Elgin Street, and look behind me where there was 35,000 people last year. Nobody. And as Mercedes mentioned, the Legion has said, please don't come to this service. Find another way to mark it. There are a few people who've shown up. You can see them just there. That's Spark Street. They're here for the ceremony. But really, it's all COVID-19 protocols. Here's an example. There was some discussion whether or not the Canadian Armed Forces band ought to play during the service. Music is a very important part of the service. But get this, the Armed Forces band, like so many other units in the Armed Forces, have been bubbling in this pandemic. They've been part of a safety bubble. So whether you're a part of a ship, a crew on a ship, maybe you're part of a tank crew, you've been bubbling with your mates, and so has the Army band. So they will be part, and an important part, of the ceremony today. Now, as I say, despite the fact that there aren't a whole lot of people here, we did manage to talk earlier today to some veterans and others. Take a listen.
Remembrance is a very personal thing. Everybody remembers in their own way. Whether you're out part of a big ceremony, or you're at home watching on TV, or you're sitting in a dark room like many of us, ruminating about the past, it doesn't matter. The important thing is to remember.
So the spirit of commemoration is still here. We still need to remember, and from everything that I've heard in the past 2 weeks, Canadians are very keen on remembering.
Well, it's very special because I'm thinking of my father who served during the war, and I'm thinking of my youth when I only had a mother to look after me when I was 6 to 11 years old while my father was overseas. And I think of all the friends that I've now lost who have passed on, who are veterans. It's different, but nonetheless it's meaningful to be here at our cenotaph, and we will lay a wreath on behalf of our Korea veterans who served in the Korean War.
So everyone, wherever you are, is going to find their own way of remembering this year. And you know, Robin, Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole, who's a veteran himself, he started a hashtag yesterday I saw called Doorstop Remembrance. So maybe wherever you are in the country at 11 o'clock, maybe perhaps grab your family, come out on the doorstop of your home and mark the time, mark the memory with your neighbors. But again, it's the act of remembrance, not where you remember, that is so important to our veterans. Robin?
That is a very good reminder. Thank you very much, David. A century ago, as the First World War ended, the world was dealing with a pandemic then. It was the influenza, and it had killed tens of millions of people. Redmond Shannon has the tragic story of one Canadian veteran of the Great War who survived the conflict but contracted the virus while looking for the grave of his son, who was killed in action.
In 1907, James Baird Brown left Scotland with his wife and children to start a new life in Winnipeg. But only 7 years later, war broke out in Europe. The young sons, James Jr. and George, enlisted to fight. 53-year-old James Sr. wanted to sign up too, so he lied about his age, saying he was only 43.
You hear about the youngers often saying they're older, but rarely do you hear about the older saying that they're younger. So I guess he felt extremely patriotic.
In 1916, George was killed in the Somme offensive. A year later, his grieving father returned to Winnipeg, discharged for being over age. Just after the war, the surviving son, James, married a British war bride in London.
Around the time of James's wedding here, his father returned to Europe to find George's grave. While passing through London, James Sr. contracted influenza during the pandemic that was killing millions, and he died, aged 56.
Who can envision what the world would have been like with a previous pandemic? And this has really brought it home, and you kind of wonder where you really are, maybe put in a position where you have no control over getting this disease.
James returned home to Winnipeg 2 years later, but he died in 1953, taking with him the answer to a mystery about his dad's fateful trip to Europe.
I don't really know if he ever found George's graveyard. That was done under the Canadian War Graves Commission, so a good chance that he may not have. I don't really know all those answers, and unfortunately I don't think there's anyone living that still does.
All we do know is that James Sr. paid the ultimate price in trying to find his son's final resting place. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Joining us from Ottawa now, Dean Oliver, the Director of Research at the Canadian Museum of History. Dean, thank you so much for being here with us today. Let's talk about the Spanish flu and how it happened near the end of the First World War. What impact did it have on soldiers who were probably in cramped trenches or cramped camps for that matter?
Well, it had a massive impact, both in camps in North America and across the fighting fronts, including those of Canadians in the United Kingdom and in France. It was particularly virulent in the young population. Think of the age and vitality of young military personnel. And so there was a higher death rate amongst the soldiers of all nations than there was a civilian death rate. And the mobility of soldiers, both going from west to east across the Atlantic Ocean and then from back from those fronts, back west to North America, spread it, including interior to the continent of North America by train. Now, military personnel, medical personnel fought valiantly in camps all over the Western world to try to defeat this, and returning doctors and nurses then re-engaged with it when they themselves returned to Canada in the winter of 1918-19. But its losses everywhere were huge, and in some communities, casualties amongst civilians were 25 or 30%. Canada as a country lost 50,000 dead, which compares quite grimly to the 66,000 it lost from military action.
Dean, when the soldiers and reservists returned to Canada after the war, they had another role, which was to help with the pandemic here in Canada.
They did. It's important to remember that the medical system in Canada in the early 20th century consisted largely of medical personnel in private practice or those working for charitable organizations. And so the largest and best equipped group of medical professionals, doctors and nurses, in particular the nursing sisters of the Canadian Forces, became very quickly the front line. They were fighting that battle in Canada, in camps before troops went overseas in early to mid 1918 as the pandemic began to take hold. They fought it again in the places like Bramshott and Whitley Camp in the United Kingdom, in Lille in France, and then they fought it again when they came home. It's also important to remember, of course, that it was military movement, much of it secret by the exigencies of war, that spread the pandemic through Canada, oftentimes with those same military personnel getting on and off ships or trains to treat people who had come down ill. In some cases, those trainloads of troops or those shiploads of troops witnessed 25 or 30% infection rates or more, and it was not uncommon for Canadian ships, transport ships in late 1918, on a single voyage to have 30 or 40 dead prior to arriving either in England or back in North America.
Dean, thank you so much for all of that information. Of course, we will go back to as we continue our coverage of Remembrance Day ceremonies here in Canada. Let's head back to the War Memorial and join our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson, once again. Mercedes, you had a chance to speak with a special guest.
Rob and I did. I spoke with Chief of the Defence Staff, General Jonathan Vance. This is his final Remembrance Day. We are awaiting the government announcement of a new Chief of the Defence Staff, and after a very difficult year for the armed forces, both working in the pandemic and with those training losses, I asked him what this Remembrance Day means to him. Here's that interview. General Vance, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You've served in theaters of war. You have troops who are abroad. What are you thinking about this Remembrance Day as you reflect?
Well, hi Mercedes, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm a bit sentimental today, actually. This will be my 6th Remembrance Day at the Cenotaph. I always bring with me sort of deliberately memories of my father, troops that I have lost on operations, particularly this year, thinking about Stalker 2-2 and the helicopter crash, Corporal Choi just recently. And I've lost some close friends as well recently. So always a sentimental moment, but one of pride as well. You know, we do excellent work overseas. I think about the troops overseas right now, standing the line for Canada, wherever we are, and doing such a great job. So it's, I think of a lot as I lay that wreath, but it's mostly pride, I feel, that we can stand in front of this great monument and remember.
In a year where the Canadian Armed Forces have suffered so many tragic training accidents, as you mentioned, what is your message to troops this year who are out there, who are hearing this, and who are having a really tough time in a pandemic year because they can't gather with their brothers and sisters in arms to observe Remembrance Day and the fallen as they normally would?
Well, a message to everybody, particularly those in uniform, is stay strong. You know, the country needs us to be strong. We have done some incredible work already during the pandemic, and during the pandemic we still do all the work that we've been assigned to do around the world. It is difficult not to be able to gather, but we can remember all of those who we should, even though we're separated and doing it at home or wherever. And so the nation requires us to be strong and resolute in everything we do, and that's my message to the troops, is be that.
This is your final year as Chief of the Defence Staff at Remembrance Day. How does that feel?
Well, as I said, I'm a bit sentimental today. It's an honor to represent the Armed Forces, standing in this hallowed spot. And so I'm grateful that I get a chance to remember along with the troops, all those who've gone before. And having done it quite a few times now, it just makes that honor deeper. So.
General Vance, thank you so much for your service, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Mercedes. Thanks very much.
So, Robin, we are still waiting to find out who the next Chief of the Defence Staff will be, but this one with General Jonathan Vance, as he reflects back after such a challenging year, and as we look around here and the weather is so warm, certainly a difficult thing for veterans not to be able to be here. It is, of course, for public health, very, very important to protect those veterans. I do see a couple gathering behind me, but it is a very different Remembrance Day for everyone.
Mercedes, there's no parade either for the veterans this year and no gathering at Legions. This is obviously very disappointing for the veterans, but they are obviously understanding that we are in a pandemic.
Yes, absolutely. They understand. I've certainly heard frustration from some veterans who say that they have seen protests. They want to know why that means they can't go if they're socially distant and stand at a war memorial. That is how some veterans feel. Others say they understand it. They want to stay home. There's certainly concern for the elderly veterans and ensuring that we protect them in particular, because normally right behind me here, we would have all the elderly vets lined up. And in a way, it's very sad. We have to protect them by keeping them at home. But for many of them, you never know which year is their last Remembrance Day. So it's certainly a feeling of loss there.
Earlier, you were talking about the fact that this is the year that Canada is not in any particular conflict, but the military has been affected with some losses. Can you guide us through that?
Absolutely, Robin. So you'll remember the crash of the Snowbird plane that was taking off in BC. They were actually flying across Canada to try to cheer Canadians up. And tragically, Captain Jennifer Casey lost her life in that crash. Then we saw shortly after that the crash of the Stalker helicopter, where we lost 6 Canadians. We don't know what happened in that crash yet. It was taking off of one of Canada's Navy ships, and it did not make it back. We've also lost Corporal Choi. He died just a few days ago in a training accident at CFB Wainwright. He was shot and killed. We don't know how that accident happened, other than it was during a live fire exercise and it was at night. We certainly were used to losing a lot of members of the Canadian Armed Forces, as incredibly sad as it was during the war in Afghanistan. But I think the military, veterans and Canadians weren't prepared to lose this many in a year where we're not in active combat. That said, keep in mind, Canada's Special Operations Forces are around the world. They absolutely see combat. We just don't hear about it. We do have Canadian troops today in Iraq, in Ukraine, in Latvia, in all kinds of other places. And I think that we don't see that on the news, so we tend to forget they're out there. But they are out there, and it is tough to be away from home on Remembrance Day for them. So certainly they're in our thoughts as well.
The good thing that we have Mercedes Stephenson here, because not only is she our Ottawa Bureau Chief, she has a background in military history. And the theme for this year's Remembrance Day, Mercedes, is the end of the Second World War. It's been 75 years. What are you hearing down on the ground about what this theme will entail?
Well, it's a very different sort of day because we don't have the Veterans March, because we don't have those elderly veterans here who are the World War II veterans, the Second World War. And you know, that's a very different feeling, because we normally have a chance to see them, to talk to them, and they walk around and literally thousands of people applaud them and thank them for their service. So we're certainly feeling that difference. And I think we are in such a different place globally now, but we reflect back on how fortunate we are to live with the kind of peace and freedom we have. That doesn't come for free. That comes with enormous sacrifice of both older and younger veterans. And keep in mind, most veterans now are actually young. We don't hear from them or see them as much, but the Afghanistan veterans, much younger, a whole different set of concerns and needs for assistance. And that's certainly something that the government is looking at. We talked to actually Veterans Affairs Minister Lawrence MacAulay earlier, and I think we have a VIP arriving right now, so I'm going to throw it back to you, Robin.
Thank you so much for that, Mercedes. Yes, the dignitaries have begun arriving. We can see that the Prime Minister is arriving, Justin Trudeau, along with his wife, Sophie Gregoire-Trudeau. They will be making their way to the War Memorial, and the Prime Minister will be met by Legion President Thomas Irvin. He's arrived. We also will expect this year's Silver Cross mother, who is Debbie Sullivan of Nova Scotia. She lost her son in 2004. Chris Saunders was on a submarine arriving from Scotland en route to Halifax. As we mentioned, Debbie Sullivan is this year's Silver Cross mother. She says she hopes to use her platform to promote better treatment of Canadian military veterans. And as I mentioned, she did lose her son, Navy Lieutenant Chris Saunders, in 2004. He was on a submarine en route from Scotland to Halifax when there was a fire on board. Ross Lord has her story.
Ladies and gentlemen, the National Silver Cross Mother. When a life comes to a sudden end, just as it's blossoming, there's a particular sadness. 16 years after Navy Lieutenant Chris Saunders died, his mother, Debbie, has never been the same.
I feel like a piece of my soul has been ripped out of my body. We're not supposed to outlive our children. He's my son, and I don't ever want him to be forgotten. So I speak his name daily. I talk to him daily.
Chris Saunders died in a fire on board a Navy submarine in 2004. HMCS Chicoutimi was en route from Scotland to Halifax to begin service in the Canadian fleet. 2 other crew members were badly injured. At age 32, Saunders had started a career as a combat systems engineer. He was married with 2 children. To keep her son's memory alive, Debbie has been named the Royal Canadian Legion's National Silver Cross Mother. She's attending Remembrance Day ceremonies in Ottawa, limited by the pandemic, but still going ahead.
They did tell me that it would be a lot smaller. They did tell me that there would be a lot of wreaths that were pre-laid ahead of time, but that I would actually be laying a wreath. Social distancing, of course, and they assured me they would keep me very safe.
Some days are still a struggle.
You know, certain songs come on and stuff, but
tough moments that arrive out of the blue.
Yeah, just different songs that remind me of him.
She takes pride in tributes, like the elementary school named after Chris in his hometown of Quispamsis, New Brunswick.
This is my favorite picture of him. He's on board a ship, he's looking out to sea. It's like he's very thoughtful and thinking. In the background is him in his football uniform, and on the other side is him mountain biking.
And he looks ruggedly handsome there.
Well, of course.
So how could you not be proud of that?
Of course he is. He's got his mama's eyes.
Finding positives in the lingering effects of tragedy. Ross Lord, Global News, Clifton Royal, New Brunswick.
And as you can see, the Silver Cross Mother has arrived. She won't be laying down a wreath because of the pandemic, and she did mention in Ross's story that the wreaths have already been laid. We are going to be seeing the arrival of Governor General Julie Payette as well. She will be greeted by the Legion President, and then she will be escorted to the dais for the vice-regal salute. As you can see, this year's ceremony is so different. It is supposed to be a day of national pride and a day of national remembrance. And as you can see, the square is so empty. It is obviously to protect our veterans. It is obviously to protect the Canadians who would normally be there, and on a day that is a very poignant day in our history. But unfortunately, our COVID guidelines have prevented this. And that signals the arrival of our Governor General.
For a change. Did you see our video in our veterans?
I have not seen that yet, but I've heard that it was spectacular.
They are the voice. They are the voice.
Absolutely. I cannot wait to see it. Excellency, we're going to go over to the dais for the vice-regal salute.
Yes.
Let's rejoin Dean Oliver from the Canadian Museum of History. Dean, as we know, the theme of this year's Remembrance Day is the end of the Second World War. It has been 75 years. Talk us through that.
Well, unlike the First World War, which ended at the same time, the Second World War ended at multiple times. In particular, it ended in the spring of 1945 in Germany and in the early fall of 1945 in the Asia Pacific. And so the celebrations and the atonement and the grief lasted a very long period of time. Outpourings of jubilation tempered by eruptions of sadness, the certainty that it was over and that you might be going home, but also marked by those 44,000 Canadians who wouldn't come back. But it also set the world on a course that it had not been set on after the First World War, where efforts to attempt to control international security, though attempted, largely failed. After 1945, there was really a sense that this could not be allowed to happen again, and the origins of many of the international organizations and compacts that we still have came out of that conflict. The United Nations Nations and eventually, by 1945, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization among them.
This is a smaller ceremony this year. How are you feeling about this?
It was very odd, I have to say, walking to the studio this morning. I've come to a studio downtown most every year for a decade and a half or so. Very odd not to see crowds and sometimes old friends, in particular volunteers who I'd worked with in my years at the Canadian War Museum. But I was also struck by numerous comments that were reported earlier, the Chief Defence Staff and people interviewed, about the personal aspect to remembrance. It's always been a multi-layered thing. There is, of course, official remembrance, national remembrance, the ceremonial aspect, encouraging people as a country or as a province to remember service in the past and what that's meant. But then there's also a very local tinge to remembrance as well. Ceremonies by military units, by small towns, by churches and schools and other social organizations. But most important of all, Robin, is the recollection of remembrance that takes place in your own mind, in your heart and soul, the people who you recall, the neighbors you recall, the families you know that has had a veteran, or the person or people in your own life with whom you commune. It doesn't matter much if you think that war is a blight on humanity and ought never to be fought, or if you, in your heart of hearts, think that every soldier who's ever worn our uniforms is a hero to me and to all. It matters that you know something about it, that you think about these people, the great events in which they took part. And while it saddens me that I'm not watching 35,000 people in silence outside today, everyone who is there, and probably everyone watching at home, has the same sentiment that somewhere this story connects with me, whether or not I'm outside a cenotaph or on a town square or not.
Yeah, you talk about the importance of Canadians taking time to remember, even if it's on our own. You gave me a homework assignment yesterday to look at our family's history. And as it turns out, our great-grandfather fought in the First World War in France. Our grandfathers on both sides of the family were fighting during the Second World War as well. So thank you for that homework assignment. I do appreciate it. And it was a time to actually look at our own family's history.
You're very welcome.
We're now approaching the 11th hour Eastern Time of the 11th day of the 11th month and the singing of O Canada.
Ladies and gentlemen, O Canada, with members of the Central Band of the Canadian Armed Forces and Beza Kenny of the Ottawa Children's Choir. Mesdames et Messieurs, O Canada, avec des membres de la musique centrale des Forces armées canadiennes et Beza Kenny du Chœur des Enfants d'Ottawa.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
Ils ne vieilliront
They shall grow not
comme
old,
nous qui
as
leur
we
avons
that are
survécu.
left grow old.
Ils ne connaîtront
Age
jamais
shall not weary
l'outrage,
them,
ni le poids
nor
des années.
the years condemn.
Quand viendra l'heure du crépuscule
At the going
et celle
down
de
of the
l'aurore,
sun and in the
nous
morning,
nous souviendrons
we
d'eux.
will remember them.
Kida majis jisteyesh iskoshiang, das kiji appetizing. Kan kida kawita mozig, onje appetizuin. Asijis and doso, bibanakak, kiji pagi nimang. Apishpangishis mojis kijis, asijis kiji bawakak, kiga mami doni nimigam. Kiga noni domigam.
Today, when we would hope to gather in person in greater numbers to honor the service and sacrifice of so many in the cause of freedom and peace, we must do so separately. Our distance from one another diminishes neither our gratitude nor the inspiration we draw from the example of these heroes we name on this day aloud or in the silence of our hearts. Dans le respect des croyances individuelles
In the respect
et de la
of
liberté de
individual
conscience de
beliefs
chacun et
and
chacune,
the freedom
je vous invite
and independence of
à prendre un moment
thought of each
de
and
recueillement.
every one of us, I ask you to reflect.
Today, we give thanks for the men and women of every generation who have answered the call to serve our country at sea, on land, or in the air, at home or abroad. We give thanks for those who continue to serve. We do not take for granted the sacrifices made by those who lay down their lives for us. En cette année qui marque le 75e anniversaire
On this
de la fin de la bataille de
75th
l'Atlantique
anniversary
et des
of the
jours de la
end
victoire
of the Second
en Europe
World
et au
War
Japon,
and victory days
nous
in
souvenons des marins,
Europe and Japan,
des
we
soldats
remember the
et des
Navy,
aviateurs
the soldiers,
qui
and
ont
the
été
aviators
déployés pour la cause de
who
la
were
paix.
deployed in the service of peace.
Puissions-nous rendre grâce pour la détermination,
May we
la force
pay homage to their
et la
courage,
volonté
valor,
qui leur furent
strength,
nécessaires
and
pour faire face aux
willingness
terribles épreuves de la guerre.
that help them survive
It
or
is with
meet
gratitude that we
the
remember
challenge of
our
war.
veterans and serving members who suffer, who have suffered injuries in body, mind, and in spirit. May we be compassionate to those who put an end to the struggle of their lives, those for whom suffering was so great and despair carried such weight. That they were unable to find hope for the future. We remember them. Nous prions pour les dirigeants de ce monde.
We pray for the leaders of this world and of our country,
Élisabeth II,
for
reine du Canada,
our Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, the Governor General, the Prime Minister, and the Chief of the Defense Staff.
We gather to affirm with one another our determination to fight beliefs which divide us, racism, hateful attitudes, and the use of violence. We seek to remove the barriers of division through a spirit of reconciliation and service. On this day when so much has changed since the last time we gathered, may we be comforted by the words from Her Majesty the Queen to Canadians in the context of this pandemic. Hope is to be found in the care given to the vulnerable and to those in need. Hope is to be found in the care given to the vulnerable and to those in need. May we find hope in the service and sacrifice made by those who offer themselves for the sake of others, because darkness of night always ends with the light of day. May this be so, and may we work to make it so. Amen.
Those prayers were given by the Chaplain General Guy Chapdelaine. And at this point, the wreath laying begins. The Governor General is always first. Julie Payette will lay a wreath on behalf of the people of Canada.
The Governor General of Canada, Her Excellency, the Right Honourable Julie Payette. La Gouverneure Générale du Canada, Son Excellence, la Très Honorable Julie Payette.
The second wreath will be laid by Silver Cross Mother Debbie Sullivan. She represents the unimaginable grief of all mothers who've had children die while serving this country. She lost her son in 2004. Navy Lieutenant Chris Saunders was on a submarine when a fire broke out and he was killed. And as we continue our coverage of Remembrance Day ceremonies in the nation's capital, the next wreath will be laid by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Notre Premier ministre, le très honorable Justin Trudeau.
George Fury, the Speaker of the Senate, will lay a wreath on behalf of Parliament.
Representing the House of Commons, the Speaker of the House, the Honourable Anthony Rota. Représentant la Chambre des Communes, le Président de la Chambre, l'Honourable Anthony Rota.
My apologies, it's Anthony Rota.
Representing Veterans Affairs Canada, the Minister of Veterans Affairs, and Associate Minister of National Defence, the Honourable Lawrence MacAulay.
And as you heard, the Minister of Veterans Affairs, Lawrence MacAulay, will lay a wreath.
Ministre associé de la Défense nationale, l'Honourable Lawrence MacAulay.
Dignitaries and veterans will continue laying wreaths for the next 10 minutes or so. At the end of this ceremony, members of the public are usually welcome to place their own wreaths, their poppies, or leave other mementos on the tomb of the unknown soldier. And normally, after this service is over, the mementos and photos are gathered up, recorded, and put in storage at the Canadian War Museum. Let's go back to the War Memorial and rejoin our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson. Mercedes, do you think that this still has that poignant, emotional feel in 2020 as opposed to other Remembrance Day ceremonies?
I do. I think even more so in so many ways, because you feel the difficulty of the pandemic right here, and you feel what that means for remembrance. And it doesn't mean that anybody who's not been able to come out to a ceremony who normally would is not able to remember, but you don't have that sense of community. And I think that that's, as we were saying earlier, Robin, so hard for some people, especially some veterans this year. But those kinds of sacrifices, the sacrifices that are keeping people safe, are sacrifices that our veterans are very, very familiar with. It's a very different feeling here this year, and it's beautiful weather, which makes it really sad because it's often so hard on the elderly vets when it's cold and raining. It is a warm day here in Ottawa. We do have some veterans who I can see just behind me over there, but not very many who have come down. When you feel the cannon firing like you did just there, the artillery unit that does that, when you hear the last post, when you hear the lament on the bagpipes, when you watch the mother, the Silver Cross mother who lost her son, lay that wreath, none of that emotion is touched by this pandemic. Nothing is taken away by that. It is a very different feeling but it is no less a moment to remember the sacrifices. It is no less sad to remember those who gave all and to pay our respects to them, because many people did not come home. And we think about them today regardless of whether we're able to gather in person, at home watching alone, or standing out on our front step. For some people, just taking a quiet moment to remember.
Thank you for that, Mercedes. Let's go back to David Akin for a moment and the thoughts he's gathered from watching this smaller ceremony today. David?
Yeah, I would agree with Mercedes completely. It was still a very powerful ceremony, very moving one. I mean, when you hear the last post, it's, the last post is mournful, it's lonely, even more so this year as you reflect on those who aren't here. And normally we'd be surrounded by 35,000 people. I'm just in front of the War Memorial here, and really just I would say maybe 1,000, 2,000 people have come downtown to be here against the recommendations, I should point out, of the Legion. And as if there are ceremonies in your community as we go to different time zones across the country, again, the Royal Canadian Legion is suggesting that this year it is best if you stay home. Another group that's not here right now, diplomats. Of course, Canadians have served and sacrificed in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, around the world. And normally at this time, you would be seeing ambassadors from other countries laying wreaths in appreciation from their countries. Those wreaths have been essentially pre-laid. They're at the bottom of the memorial right now. And I can tell you, whenever a visiting world leader comes to Ottawa on an official visit, the first thing they do, they come here to lay a wreath, again, in appreciation of the sacrifice of Canadian troops. And I've traveled abroad, Mercedes has, with our Prime Minister, and whenever our Prime Minister visits another country, almost inevitably the first stop is to a war memorial in the UK or France or Korea or Hong Kong, wherever we travel, again, to recognize the sacrifices of Canadians to defend freedom around the world, wherever they may be. But a very different ceremony this year, but again, one that powerful and moving, Robin.
David Akin, thank you so much for your insight there. It has been 75 years since the end of the Second World War, and that is the predominant theme of this year's Remembrance Day ceremony. We have a very heartfelt story about how all these years later, a trio from Canada and England came together to fix an old mistake and give a fallen Canadian airman the respect he deserved. Abigail Beeman introduces us now to Flying Officer Morley Ornstein.
Morley Ornstein, Flying Officer Morley Ornstein.
Morley Ornstein was just 20, killed in action in the Second World War.
By default, they put a cross on Morley's grave, even though it's clear that he was of Jewish faith. And 75 years went by and nobody noticed until I did.
Ellen Besner wrote a book about the 17,000 Canadian Jews who served in that war. When she noticed Ornstein's grave had a cross, she wanted to fix it.
I'm a mom of boys who are that age. And Morley died and sacrificed himself so that my kids could go to university, my kids could finish high school, and my kids could have a life here in freedom in Canada.
Besner worked with a British historian who has helped change more than 100 incorrect war grave emblems to Stars of David.
It's part of the struggle against anti-Semitism. It's part of the struggle against people who lie about that Jews didn't serve in proportion to their numbers in the population, when in fact the reverse is true.
On Ornstein's war records, you can see his own handwriting, identifying himself as Hebrew.
They were my mother's friends.
And they had help from another Morley.
He had a lovely sense of humor.
92-year-old Morley Wolfe grew up on the same street as Morley Ornstein. He wrote a letter to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission.
I have a clear recollection of Morley's parents conversing with mine on occasion in Yiddish.
Their efforts worked.
The different pieces of the puzzle that come together to mean that we can be confident that he identified as a Jew, and therefore that is the most appropriate religious emblem.
The transport process is held up by the pandemic, but Flying Officer Morley Ornstein's new stone is ready. We showed it to his old friend.
Lovely. Well earned. Well deserved.
Abigail Beeman, Global News.
What a beautiful story, Abigail. Joining me again from Ottawa is Dean Oliver, the Director of Research at the Canadian Museum of War. Dean, we didn't get a chance to talk about the horrors and the trenches and how 105 years ago the use of gas was just so horrific and what it was like in warfare then.
Yes, I'm reminded in the ceremony, and watching the physicality of it, the nature of the event itself, just how many of those things trace themselves to those battlefields of the First World War. The most obvious being the poppy, but the monument and the memorial itself. The First World War, like all wars, gave vent to man's macabre creativity. In every conflict since the beginning of human time, we've figured out new ways to maim and murder one another. The First World War was no exception, but the first major battle in which Canadians participated, which was in the spring of 1915 at Ypres, saw the first large-scale use of poison gas on the Western Front. In the end, when the war was over, fewer than about 1% of all fatalities on all sides had been as a result of gas. But the nature of gas, its impersonality, the nature of its effect on the body and its various types, made it a feared weapon, perhaps out of all proportion to its lethality. In the end, about 6,000 Canadians were gas fatalities, many thousands of people from other countries. And one of its lasting impacts, of course, was that the effects of gas was often not manifest on the body until many, many years later. Other wars had other things that were created, most notably perhaps nuclear weapons in the Second World War. But the horror of the trenches is often writ small in the horror of those Canadians and others facing gas in that first April of 1915, when this greenish, yellowish cloud began to move towards them, and they had no idea what it was or how it would impact them.
Dean, as we know, history repeats itself. There was another war soon after, and this year marks the 80th anniversary of ground forces being committed to Second World War. Explain how that was established.
Well, the Second World War carried within it many of the lessons and all of the fears of the First. Canada and other countries in the 1930s were reluctant to commit internationally to a course of action that might lead them into conflict again. And so many of us were a little slow off the mark in realizing the threat posed by European fascism and Japanese militarism. When it began in 1939 for us, not until 1941 for the United States, of course, our initial reactions were to limit ground force involvement by committing warships or the Navy and our small but rapidly growing Air Force. Still, by 1940, we had a division-sized force in Europe, the first of our major commitments, and not long after that, we would send 2 battalions, famously, tragically, to Hong Kong in the Asia-Pacific theater. And very briefly, Robin, after the evacuation, the famous evacuation from Dunkirk, after the successful German assault on the western countries of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, that Canadian division was pretty much the best equipped Allied division in the United Kingdom had the Germans invaded, which they planned to do, but for the Battle of Britain, in which, of course, Canadians also served. So 1939 was our entrance into the war, our first losses, our first glimpse at what these next years were going to be like. But 1940 was the first major commitments on multiple fronts, notably land, sea, and air in the North Atlantic and northwestern Europe.
Dean, you are a plethora of historical information. Thank you so much for your time. And that concludes our coverage of this year's Remembrance Day ceremony from the National War Memorial in Ottawa. Thank you for spending your time with us, for taking a moment out of your day to remember, pay tribute, and reflect on so many people who have lost their lives. I'm Robin Gill. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to join Donna Friesen tonight for Global National, and I'll see you this weekend. Take care.
In our national anthem, that we will stand on God for thee, literally for every thee. We remember today in a way unlike previous years, because today, whether or not we realize, we are all soldiers in battle, each with a defined role on Team Canada. That role in general is to save lives by acting responsibly, by following the model of selflessness and devotion set by our veterans. Let us continue to make Canada worthy of their ongoing dedication and sacrifice. A country defined by respect, harmony, inclusion, responsibility, and kindness to all. God bless our veterans. God bless our troops. God bless all those who stand on guard, all champions of peace, safety, security, and tranquility. God bless Canada. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, God Save the Queen, with Maria Delaney of the Ottawa Children's Choir. And to mark the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, a vintage aircraft flypast will conclude the ceremony. Mesdames et messieurs, que Dieu protège la reine, avec Maria Delaney, du Chœur des Enfants d'Ottawa. Et pour marquer le 75e anniversaire de la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, un défilé aérien d'avions d'époque conclura la cérémonie. Unfortunately, due to the weather, the flypast has been canceled. Le défilé est annulé. Thank you for your attendance at the National Remembrance Day ceremony. Today, as a grateful nation, we stand in collective remembrance of all who have fallen in the military service of Canada. May we never forget. Please stay in position while the Vice-Regal Party departs. Merci d'être parmi nous à l'occasion de la cérémonie nationale du Jour du Souvenir. Aujourd'hui, à l'occasion où notre nation reconnaissante exprime à l'unisson le souvenir de ceux et celles qui sont morts au service de notre pays. N'oublions jamais. Veuillez rester en place pendant la sortie du cortège vice-royal. Finally, each evening over the past 2 weeks during this year's National Poppy Campaign, the Royal Canadian Legion Dominion Command has been honored to present its virtual poppy drop. It can be seen on the backdrop of the Peace Tower on Parliament Hill and on the Senate building. The poppy drop is also displayed outside the National Arts Centre. There will be a concluding presentation this evening from 6:30 p.m. to midnight. Finalement, nous tenons à mentionner qu'au cours des 2 dernières semaines de notre campagne nationale du coquelicot de cette année, la Légion royale canadienne a eu l'honneur et le privilège de vous offrir chaque soir une projection spéciale, celle de la pluie virtuelle du coquelicot, sur l'écran formé de la Tour de la Paix, sur la colline parlementaire et sur l'édifice du Sénat. La pluie du coquelicot est aussi visible sur la façade du Centre national de circumstances.
I know how important that is. Monsieur, how are you?
Very good. How are you?
Very
good to see you. Nice to see you again. Looking sharp today.
Circumstances, sir.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I salute you.
I salute you. Thank you for being here. And at least it's not raining. But you've seen worse.
A naval officer.
Yes.
I'm proud of it.
Absolutely. As you can see, I am proudly wearing the Navy uniform today.
And I did too.
Well, the Navy says it's the best one. Are they right?
You're absolutely correct.
Sir, thank you for the service for Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sir, how are you? Thank you for representing the RCMP. Men and women in uniform, serving the country. Thank you. Sir,
Votre Excellence.
comment allez-vous, monsieur?
Très bien, madame.
Vous venez de quel endroit?
Le militaire et la GRC. Je suis vétéran de la GRC.
Excellent.
De Gatineau.
Alors, vous allez poser la gerbe avec monsieur
Oui.
Couteau.
Oui. Oui.
De Gatineau. Oui.
C'est un honneur.
On honore ici, en cette journée, vous savez, tous les hommes et toutes les femmes qui servent en uniforme, qui ont servi et qui servent encore pour le Canada.
Votre Excellence.
Alors, vous en faites partie, monsieur. Merci pour votre service.
Thank you very much.
Pour faire la différence entre
Dans toujours le monde sur la télévision, sur l'Internet, donc bonjour, M. le Premier ministre. Votre service d'être ici. C'est un honneur d'être ici pour représenter les vétérans de la GRC. So sorry for you.
Thank you very much. I want to hug you so badly.
I know.
Thank you for your service. I really appreciate everything.
Thank you and your service.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I wasn't in very long, but
It counts.
it counts, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Very well. Prime Minister, representing so many. They couldn't be anywhere else.
The citation itself, you can see the chevrons to the left indicating the past. The chevrons to the right indicate the future.
5 tours, 4 in Bosnia, 1 in Haiti.
10 in the center.
So
that is for service to those veterans.
We
have no.
I agree. The world needs us. Needs more cancer.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry. Tu fais des temps?
Bien, votre Excellence.
Ça va bien, vous?
Ça fait quelques années.
Toujours, hein, mais les années passent.
Oui. On continue avec les cheveux gris.
Ah, ça, vraiment gentil.
I like your uniform. You're looking good.
Ah, vous savez, c'est les gens de la marine disent que c'est le plus beau des uniformes.
J'ai une autre opinion, mais
Exactement.
l'année prochaine.
Oui, l'année prochaine. Exactement. Vous savez, ce sera mon 5e jour de souvenir avec cet honneur, ce privilège de représenter le pays. Et je le ferai avec l'uniforme que j'ai plus ou moins porté toute cette vie. Je prendrai rien, monsieur.
On apprécie votre service aussi.
Merci beaucoup.
Thinking of all our
The other side.
I'll be right there. Right there.
I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
Yes, it was an emotional time.
It was, but at least it wasn't snowing.
Thank you very much.
It's really weird to see everything empty. Huh?
Unbelievable.
Usually there's people everywhere.
35,000 last year.
I know. Next year we're going to do 70,000.
Absolutely.
To make it work.
Absolutely.
Can I see
Ministre, bonjour. Plaisir de vous voir.
Il nous a payé. On n'aurait pas été le paro.
Merci de la représentation. C'est pour ça,
Mon grand-père était dans la RCR.
Ah oui?
Il a servi dans l'Afrique du Nord pendant la Deuxième Guerre.
Ça fait 36 ans que j'ai servi, mais on n'oublie jamais.
On a aussi perdu la famille de Gregoire, mais on a un peu pour on est avec vous.
Merci d'être ici aujourd'hui.
C'est nous qui vous remercions.
La tradition
Puis l'année prochaine, on va le faire sans masque.
Tout à fait.
Et bras de support.
Tout à fait.
Melga, how are you?
I'm well, you?
It's not raining.
This is one of the nicer, warmer Remembrance days.
You've been with me now for 3 years, for sure, and it was absolutely excruciatingly cold every time. But then I think of the soldiers who suffered such horrors for months on end. I think we can Canadians suffer
for an hour, for 1 hour, a little bit of cold.
Hello, how are you? Very well, how are you? Nice to see you. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. We often find these days, yes.
Thanks
we
for doing
keep
that, Joe.
to ourselves and we
Appreciate it.
see each other via digital. Yes. But I can tell you for astronauts, it's kind of normal.
Normal, eh?
It is. On a va taper un ami. C'est fun.
Great to see you.
Absolutely. More than ever.
I like seeing people.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Navy thing. Travel too.
All right.
Yeah.
It's not raining as I said, but though it wouldn't bother
The Black Watch of Canada. The headquartered in Montreal.
Honorary Colonel.
Oh. Honorary Colonel now.
Well, I hope that when this pandemic is over, we can get together. I'll try and do some drills. You can teach me a thing or two. of course, it represents not only the Polish, but the coordination that was between the Canadian and the Polish army. I visited, Montepulciano in Italy, and I'm sure you have as well. And I was so impressed by the, it was like the International Space Station in Gregoire-Trudeau. People who didn't know each other, young boys, who decided to do the work.
You don't want that either. It's a great day. Get the vaccine. Well, that's all right. We've here. Good to see you. You're not freezing today. No long johns and everyone does it. Oh, yes, representing the 5 surviving members of Sea Force to Hong Kong.
Excellent. Serving, how big the force was in Hong Kong? How many of you were there?
Not me.
Not you.
No.
You were representing them.
My father and 8 family members. But 1976.
And how many, there was a lot of casualties?
Oh, yes. There was, between there was about 400 casualties in the fighting, and then another roughly 400 died in prison.
It's probably a horrible condition. We don't understand that. We need to keep on going along
we try.
so that our young people understand the privilege of peace, for which we fought for. Thank you, sir, for being here.
Quel dernier, madame? On va aller prendre le salut par
How are you? Nice to be here with everyone. Color party, okay.
Yes, get used to it, I guess, huh?
Great seeing you again. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Yes, that's right. Right, yeah. Yeah, very nice, yeah.
Just a petit I'm just going to say thank you to the singers. Ottawa Children's Choir. Well done, Hannah. Piece of very, very well
I don't get Hey! Excuse me would work, but
I just feel great up. Who would not? Do you have other children? Yes, I have.
I know every now and then I run into an old friend of my little brother's and just connect, and of people who knew him, who saw him. It really is
I will never forget things like that around but I think
You're right away,
Monsieur Denis va venir nous rejoindre à nous à...
With 4 dignitaries. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am, take care.
Thank you for being here. Merci. Salut. Et voilà.
Est-ce qu'on va vidéo encore? Moi, je suis déjà.
C'est bien, je vais les chercher.
Ouais, c'est ça, ouais. No, she wants to go video hall. Video hall. I may go get some stuff. Oh, okay, no, that's perfect. I'll talk to
Thank you for coming out. Stay safe.